All right. What a pleasure to be here. What a pleasure to be in the beautiful weather in Aspen. Thank you guys all for coming. We're going to launch right into it because we don't have a lot of time. I thought what I'd do is, I don't know if I'm supposed to introduce, Henry Kissinger once said, those who need no introduction crave them the most. But we are going to bet that these two do not crave them. So Zanny Minton-Betters is the editor-in-chief of The Economist. Tom Friedman is Tom Friedman. And we're going to get going. So to me, the way to set the scene for this conversation is to step back and ask yourself whether the Middle East has really just gone through one of these fundamental reorderings and reorganizations that happen from time to time on the international stage. Think about the old Middle East. The old Middle East 30, 40 years ago was a Middle East dominated by the biggest countries in the Middle East, principally Egypt, Syria, Iraq. When the Israelis did war planning, the armies they worried about were the great Iraqi army, the great Syrian army, and the great Egyptian army. If you look at the Middle East today, those countries have essentially collapsed and lost any ability to project military or even economic power abroad. The new Middle East is powered by a fascinating shift in that landscape. First, you have seen, instead of the old large countries, the new small countries dominate the Middle East. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates are much, much more powerful than they have ever been before. The world comes to them for capital. They have enormous impact and influence around the world. The second piece of this is a Turkey that has become more and more powerful, waiting on its wings. Turkey's per capita GDP has gone up fivefold in the last 25, 30 years, and it has a series of interests it worries a great deal about. And then finally, and perhaps most dramatically, the rise of Israel, which really has become the superpower of the Middle East, technologically, militarily, economically. Think of one statistic. In 1980, just when the Islamic Republic of Iran is founded, Israel's per capita GDP and Iran's per capita GDP are not that different. I think Israel was twice as large in per capita GDP terms as Iran. Today, Israel's per average income is 10 times that of Iran's. And that doesn't get into the military or technological superiority. The old issues of the Middle East were the issues between the secular dictatorships of Egypt, Syria, Iraq, battling against Islamic fundamentalists who were trying to unseat them. Today, that debate is over. To a large extent, the debate is between the functional Middle East, countries like the Gulf states, and the dysfunctional ones that remain countries like Yemen, Lebanon, Iraq, Syria. And as I say, through it all, you have the rise of an Israel that now commands the stage so much that the Gulf Arab states want closer ties with it, that its principal adversary, Iran, is now a shadow of its former self. So that strikes me as a very new world. And what we're going to try and do is explore, in the time we have, what that world looks like. So Zanny, I want you to start by talking about what could go right. We spend a lot of time in the Middle East thinking about what can go wrong, and history usually confirms that that is a useful way to think about things, because I think Richard Haas once said, in the Middle East, just when you think it couldn't get worse, it usually does. What could go right?
So it's true that in the Middle East, pessimism pays. So it helps that I'm not a Middle East expert. And certainly relative to Tom, your career really, primarily the Middle East, I first went to Israel in 2017 in this role. As my family who are here somewhere will tell you, I've become completely obsessed with the region since then and have been going all over it. But I have the optimism of a non-decadal-long specialist. And I do think that there is a moment now that could lead to a very different Middle East than the one we've seen over the last 2 decades, 3 decades even. But I don't think it's automatic. The reason I think there is a moment is that I think you're right, Fareed, there is a functional Middle East that wants, as President Trump said in Riyadh, commerce, not chaos. It's primarily around the Gulf, and these countries want growing economies, they want prosperity, and they want closer ties with Israel, but we've had what has happened since October the 7th. What I think now, and why right in this moment I'm feeling somewhat optimistic, is that I think what's happened in the last 12 days is a 5-decadal change with Iran. I'm not Panglossian enough to think that this is the end necessarily of Iran's nuclear ambitions. I certainly don't think it's necessarily the end of the regime, but I do think that it has bought time, and it has bought time that if properly used by one person in particular, and that person is Donald Trump, could actually put the region on a better trajectory. And if you look back in President Trump's first term, I think the single most impressive foreign policy achievement he had was the Abraham Accords. And I think he hasn't got enough credit for that because people like me, people like you, we thought much of the rest of his foreign policy was a mess and dangerous, and therefore we didn't pay enough attention to just how pivotal that was. What the Abraham Accords did, as you know, is normalize relations with the UAE, Bahrain, and others, and that relationship between Israel and those countries is fundamentally different. What I think he can do now is essentially continue to put pressure on Bibi Netanyahu, and this is a big if, to end the war in Gaza, to acknowledge some framework that in due course will lead to some Palestinian entity, which will open up the normalization of relations, not just with Saudi Arabia, but before that, I think, with Lebanon and Syria. And I'll end with this. I was in Syria 3 months ago, and I interviewed Ahmed al-Shara, who is the new president of Syria, a man who 10 years ago was ordering people in suicide vests to go and blow themselves up. He was the head of al-Qaeda in Syria, and I sat opposite him, I sat where you were there, and I remember in the interview thinking, okay, a decade ago, this guy was blowing up, ordering people to be blown up. He talked to me about the future of Syria, and I thought, this man is not a Democrat in the sense that I'm a Democrat, but he is a man who wants his country to prosper. He is a man who wants, frankly, to be like Mohammed bin Salman, who also wants his country to prosper. He wants commerce, not chaos. He wants to normalize relations with Israel. Lebanon wants to normalize relations with Israel. I think this path is there if Bibi Netanyahu takes it from the strength that he's now got in Israel. And the only bit I disagree with you, Fareed, is I don't think a country with 10 million people can be a regional hegemon in the way that the US can be a hegemon. I think if you extrapolate the cost of what they did in Iran, it would be 20% of Israel's GDP. You just can't keep that scale of military effort going. But I think the path is there. The question is, will Bibi Netanyahu take it, and will President Trump push him? And it will require lots of things that you don't associate with President Trump: steadfastness, determination, willingness to engage. But it's possible. So that's why I'm feeling that there is a reason to be optimistic.
Okay. So Tom, road to a Palestinian state, normalization between Israel, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Lebanon. What could go wrong? If you were if you were Secretary of State, how would you handle this?
Well, I say a couple things, Fareed. One is that this question of optimism and pessimism that Zania raised remind me, like 15 years ago, I was in Israel having dinner at the home of the editor of Haaretz, the New York Times of Israel, and they run my column, and they run it in Hebrew. And that means a lot to me, because I get to be a local columnist in Israel. So I said to him, why do you run my column? And he said, you're the only optimist we have. And there was an Israeli general there, Uzi Dayan. He said, I know why you're an optimist, Tom. I said, why? He said, it's because you're short. And I said, short? He said, yeah, you can only see the part of the glass that's half full. Okay, so I'm actually not that short. So since Fareed has assigned me the downside, I'm going to do it at 2 levels, Fareed. One is from American point of view and one local point of view. The way I can best express the American reason for concern is that I want to talk to all the parents in the audience right now. Mom, Dad, if your son or daughter come home from college and say, Mommy, Daddy, I want to be Secretary of State one day, tell them, honey, anything but that, okay? You can be Secretary of Agriculture, Commerce, HHS, but promise, Mommy and Daddy, you won't be Secretary of State. Worst job in the world today. Why is that? Well, contrast an October War in 1973 with an October War in 2023. Henry Kissinger, after the October War in 1973, needed an airplane, 3 dimes, and 3 months. He needed 3 dimes, a dime to call the Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir, a dime to call the Syrian President Hafez al-Assad, a dime to call the Egyptian President Anwar Sadat. 3 months, Kissinger magic, and he put together the first disengagement agreements in the Middle East, the diplomatic equivalent of tic-tac-toe, 3 across: Egypt, Syria, Israel. Fast forward to Tony Blinken. Tony Blinken saw double everywhere he went. In Gaza, he had to deal with inside Hamas and outside Hamas, military Hamas and political Hamas. In Lebanon, he had to deal with the Lebanese government and Hezbollah. In Syria, he had to deal with Russia, Iran, and the Syrian government. He saw double and triple everywhere he went. If Kissinger was playing tic-tac-toe, Tony Blinken had a Rubik's Cube, and he was trying to get all the colors aligned on one side. And if you have ever tried that, that's really hard. Promise, Mommy and Daddy, you won't try to be Secretary of State. Now, my reason for pessimism, Fareed, is very simple. To take advantage of this moment that you and Zanny have described so well, we actually need 3 regime changes. You need a regime change in Israel, you need a regime change among Palestinians, and you need a regime change in Iran, okay? If Israel has election and Bibi Netanyahu wins again, God bless him. But if he puts together this coalition again, that's what I mean by regime change, nothing is happening. This is the most radical, extreme, messianic government in the history of Israel, and this government, in its aspirations, which is to annex the West Bank, is not a friend of American interests in the Middle East. That regime has to change. Second, the Palestinian regime has to change. You need a complete overhaul of the Palestinian Authority, building real institutions around real serious people that are in that community, but this thing has gone on way too long, and it's completely hobbled the Palestinians. And lastly, you need regime change in Iran. Now, that regime change can happen gradually. It can happen a shift in the power of the elite, but you have to have a regime that basically says, we are going to be a country focused on our own internal development, not occupying 4 Arab states, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, and using our resources to basically destabilize the region. So because those 3 regime changes are so hard, but I secretly share Zanny's hope, okay, that this time might be different.
So let's drill down on one of those countries, one of those actors. As I said, the one I think that is now really in the catbird seat. And let's personalize it, because I do think the big winner out of all this is Bibi Netanyahu. And let's be honest, you had your disagreements with him. I've had my disagreements with him. He has handled this remarkably well. Put aside the Gaza issue for a moment, which is its own very complicated issue and certainly a humanitarian catastrophe. But in the north, what Bibi did was fundamentally change the balance of power in the region. He went after Hezbollah. They collapsed, turned out to be a paper tiger. He goes out, he continues the strikes on Syria. The Syrian regime collapses. He goes after Iran's air defenses. The Iranians turn out to be a paper tiger as well, can barely respond to those attacks on their air defenses, and then decides to go after Iran itself. He also figures out how lack of a better word, to play Donald Trump. He gets Donald Trump to support him. Trump says he wants a deal. He says, yeah, you keep trying to do a deal. And then when the deadline that Trump had set expires, this is, by the way, the first deadline that Trump has ever set where once it expired, he actually did something about it, right? He says to him, now you got to let me go. Guessing, I think, that the Israeli operation would go well and that Trump would have FOMO and fear of missing out and want to jump in. And I think he managed all of that remarkably well. Look, he got a number of lucky breaks along the way, but I think he did the strikes as much to preempt American diplomatic action and an American diplomatic deal with Iran as Iran's nuclear weapons. He wanted to make sure that Iran does not have some kind of reconciliation with the United States, force the action, force the Americans to come in. As far as I can tell, he's handled this extraordinarily well. What are Iran's options at this moment, Zanny?
Can I just slightly
You can absolutely disagree.
With your Bibi was so wonderful take. I think success, brilliant strategy is always recognized in hindsight. And I think he got a lot of lucky breaks. I was in Israel the week before this started. And the mood amongst most of the sort of security establishment, you were there just a few days before I was that Israel was missing the boat strategically, that Bibi was mired in this endless war in Gaza with horrific consequences, which was radically changing the global perception of Israel. It was increasingly seen as a pariah state by many in Europe. It had no strategy. Meanwhile, President Trump comes to the region, he goes to the Gulf, he doesn't even come to Israel. And the view in Tel Aviv at that point was that Israel was being left behind. And I don't actually think that I think he's been obsessed with Iran. I last saw him a year ago, and I can't give you the details because it was very firmly off the record and just me, but suffice to say that for 2 hours I listened to an extremely articulate lecture about Iran. So he was very focused on Iran then. Yes, Israel did amazingly with Hezbollah. I think Syria had less to do with Israel than it did with the collapse of Bashar Assad and actually al-Shara. But in this last 2 weeks, I think he was very lucky. They went on without the Americans on board. You're right that President Trump probably had FOMO and then wanted to get on with it, but it was a big gamble. And it's one that now puts Bibi, yes, he's been very successful, but it puts him in a position where he basically can't say no to Donald Trump. And that's why I focus more on Trump than on Bibi, because I think that, for me, the most telling thing was not when he walked to Air Force One and swore in front of the cameras. It was the Truth Social post afterwards where he basically said, turn those planes around. And the planes were turned around. And there needs to be a bit more of that to push Bibi to do what you say he absolutely has to do. So where I think there needs to be regime change in the sense of dramatic policy change and coalition change. Yeah. But actually, I think Bibi Netanyahu, you know much, much better than I do, could do this because he's an absolute chameleon. He could do this. So it's not, I think it's not all due to the strategic brilliance of Bibi Netanyahu.
As Napoleon said when somebody asked him, what do you look for in your generals? And he said, one quality, luck. I like lucky generals. Tom, what are Iran's options right now? How do you look at the situation with Iran?
Well, I'm going to pick up on this, and then we'll go with that. Bibi Netanyahu and I do not exchange Hanukkah cards, so I have no idea what's going on in his head. But I operate out of a general principle that to understand the Middle East, I believe, the Arab-Israeli conflict, you actually have to hold 3 thoughts in your head at the same time. And unfortunately, that's very hard, particularly on American college campuses, okay? One thought is that Israel is an amazing place. What Israel has built in 75 years, by way of technology, agriculture, ingathering of exiles, Israel's an amazing creation, okay? Number one. Number two, Israel does really bad stuff sometimes. And it's doing really bad stuff as we speak in the West Bank right now and in Gaza. And third, Israel lives in a crazy neighborhood. Okay. Now, what people want to say often is Israel's, it's amazing. They just do bad stuff. Leave them alone, they live in a crazy... No, all three are actually true at the same time. And that is true about Bibi Netanyahu, okay? He just achieved a monumental victory over some really bad actors who have perverted not only Israel, because for me, I use the Princess Di rule here. There are three people in this marriage, okay? It's not just Israel and Iran. It's Israel and Iran, and I'll deal with them as a collective. Lebanon, a country I care very much about, Syria and Iraq, who have been occupied by Iran, basically, for all these years. They are as much rooting for the downfall of the regime in Tehran as anyone in Tel Aviv. So basically, you have this sort of tripartite situation with Netanyahu, where on the one hand, he achieved an incredibly important victory. At the same time, he has pursued Hamas well after it has been defeated at the expense of the hostages, and they are killing a lot of people in Gaza who should not be killed, okay? And at the same time, at home, he is pursuing a judicial coup to destroy the Israeli Supreme Court to pave the way for the annexation of the West Bank. So I can keep all three of those thoughts in my head at the same time, and I would urge people too when you think about him. Now, one of the most interesting dynamics, my friend Ari Shavit pointed this out to me in a column I wrote the other day, is that the people who delivered this victory for Israel, I'm talking about the Air Force pilots, the technologists, the strategists, the scientists, the cyber warriors, were for the most part the same people who on the eve of the Hamas war had spent 9 months in the streets of Israel protesting against Bibi's judicial coup. So they will be damned if he is going to take this victory that they delivered, these scientists, this tip of the Israeli spear, and use it to win the next election to produce an Israel that their kids will not want to live in. So Israel today, my fear is, just to finish this point, Israel today is the country the Iranian middle class wants to be, and Iran today is the country the Israeli secular elite fears it could become.
So let me push back on personalizing it with Bibi Netanyahu, because I think what has happened in Israel is a much broader shift. The Israeli political spectrum has moved significantly to the right over the last 30 years. And perhaps it began with Camp David and the Palestinian rejection of the offer. I think a lot of it had to do with 1.5 to 2 million Russian Jews who came to Israel. A lot of it had to do with the growing religiosity of the Haredi. But as a result, I am not sure it's fair to say that, Israel would be willing to make peace with the Palestinians, have a Palestinian state. It's just Bibi Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. I think Israel, not Bibi, Israel is currently not willing to solve the Palestinian problem. The Palestinians, God knows, have their own issues with their leadership. But I think it's going to take a lot more than a few changes in the coalition to get something going on that very fundamental issue.
The polls absolutely affirm what you say. Clearly, there is not support within Israel for a two-state solution. And two-state solution has become essentially shorthand for failed policy since Oslo. And no one sees that as the path forward. But I don't think the alternatives are that or the kind of messianic view of Smotrich and his co, which is not, it's basically annexation of the West Bank and resettlement of Gaza. And he is, by the way, a kind of mild-mannered in his demeanor and completely crackers when you talk to him. But those aren't the only options. I think there is a large swath of Israeli society which would not be in favor of anything like Oslo, not be in favor of an imminent two-state solution, but can see a framework that allows some kind of autonomous entity for the Palestinians that has Israeli security first and foremost. And October 7th was understandably, of course, an absolute sort of psyche-shaking event. I mean, I lived here in 9/11, and just remember how 9/11 changed this country. And this was just so much more horrific than in scale relative to the population. So I totally understand why the country feels the way it does. But I think increasingly there is a view within Israel that there has to be a path forward, that it has first and foremost Israeli security, but then has some kind of framework towards something that is autonomous. Don't call it two-state, but call it something that allows not the PA, but some kind of less corrupt, more effective Palestinian authority to have some form of self-government.
Okay, so we always end up discussing the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and I don't want to get away from Iran, which is the crisis at hand. So Tom, how will this play out, do you think?
And Iran.
On Iran.
Yeah, well, I've been to Iran twice, and both times I wrote about it, even when I was there, Fareed. This was in the late 90s. There were debates in the parliament every time I was there. Why are we giving money to Hamas? Why are we giving money to Hezbollah? Why are we in these stories at all? There's a huge Iranian, middle class desire, to be a normal country. I think right now you're going to have a real debate inside between what Zanny and I were talking about, backstage, between the guys with the guns, okay, and basically the more moderate engagers, as it were. And this is not a regime that's going to be forced out from the bottom up. They will kill as many, they've proven that since 1979, they'll kill as many people as they have to. But it can split at the top. And there can be a faction of the Revolutionary Guards that says, you know what, I see our future with the more moderate. The question is, how do they interpret what happened? Do they interpret what happened, this is what happens because we didn't get a bomb, or this is what happens because we spent all these years trying to get a bomb? And that debate will take a long time. What I fear, though, Fareed, is that it's not going to be pretty. Right now, we had an amazing story in our paper this morning about just the witch hunt going on in Iran for who were the spies and who worked with Israel. No one trusts anybody. Yeah. Can you imagine being at the Iranian cabinet meeting, and wondering who is working for who, and that's not conditions for clear thinking and trusting people. And the best way to delegitimize your opponent is to say he's working with the Jews, I would just say one thing on the Palestinian thing, because I think it's important to pick up, and I share Zanny's view on this, which is that my view, I've been advocating a two-state solution, by the way, all through this war, and people criticize me, are you delusional, to which I say, look, I realize it has about a 5% chance of success, but I'm going to give 100% of my energy to that 5%, because I'll tell you what the alternative is. It's not a one-state solution, not a three-state solution. It's actually no states for two people. It will be an ongoing war, basically between 9 million Jews and 8 million, and that will be actually no states for two people. And so I think, though, we cannot go from here to if Henry Kissinger were alive today, he wouldn't be saying, okay, now land for peace, where's the border going to be? We now need a peace process for the peace process. And that's what I call Palestinian institution building for Israeli restraint. Palestinian institution building with clear KPIs. Do this, you had to achieve that, you achieve that. And on the Israeli side, a complete and total freeze on settlements outside the block areas that would be preserved for a Palestinian state. That's where I would start.
Okay, so it seems to me that one interesting kind of optimistic note one could end on is, if you think about the energy of the Gulf states, the degree to which they really have become vast pools of capital with small countries attached to them. These are basically hedge funds with small countries that are attached to them. And what they want is peace and stability. They want economic opportunities. And that is a very different narrative, master narrative coming out of the Arab world than has come out for, think about, the days of Pan-Arabism and Nasser, the days of Islamic fundamentalism, and the Saudis' support for all of that. Now what you have is, a Saudi Arabian crown prince who is basically trying more than anything else to modernize his country. Trump gave that speech about how, thank God you're not listening to outsiders. Actually, the entire Crown Prince's plan was drafted by McKinsey. Literally, the Saudi Arabian government has been McKinsey's largest client for the last 10 years. So it's just a different set of Western consultants who are now kind of rewriting the plans for the Middle East. But in a way, it's a note of optimism. And in a way, we forget, even going back historically, it is a chance for the Arabs to finally claim their own destiny. You know, this is a part of the world that was dominated by the Western colonial powers, but before that, for 500 years, was dominated by the Ottoman Empire. I mean, the last time the Arabs really ruled themselves was 1,000 years ago. This is, in a sense, their second chance. The last thought.
Yeah, just one piece of evidence for precisely that, which is a small one, but I think really important. The person who was most influential in ensuring that President Trump lifted the sanctions on Syria, which, having been there, was, if it hadn't happened, Syria would be in utter collapse, was Mohammed bin Salman. It was Saudi Arabia played a pivotal role in convincing Donald Trump to lift those sanctions. Saudi Arabia is becoming, and goodness me, he's had a checkered history, MBS, but it is now becoming a force for stability, a force for it. He has this vision, and everyone wants to buy into this vision. That's what al-Shara wants to do. There is a vision of, as President Trump said, commerce, not chaos. And it's not inevitable, but it is a vision that I think it's actually very helpful that the President of the United States shares. He cares about real estate and he cares about commerce. This is a fortuitous coming together of the two of these. And that's why, actually, I am optimistic. And I will, I hope I'm proved right. And probably I'll be proved wrong. But I do think the potential is there. And we could come back in a couple of years and we could have the biggest progress towards real stability in this region than we've seen in a long time.
I want to give a shout out for Zanny's optimism, but let me start back. I got hired by UPI on Fleet Street in 1978. Yeah, do the math. I'm 71. So, and the number 2 man in the Beirut bureau of UPI got shot in the ear, and they said, "Would you like to go to Beirut and replace him?" You know, and me and my little wife from Des Moines, Iowa, went off to Beirut in 1979. These are the first 4 stories I covered: the Iranian Revolution, the takeover of the Grand Mosque in Mecca, the signing of the Camp David Peace Treaty, and the inauguration by Queen Elizabeth II of a port called Jebel Ali in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. Little did I know that those forces, the forces of resistance and the forces of inclusion that were born there, would basically frame my entire career up to today. And that's how I see basically the struggle globally. You know, what was going on in the world in 2022? Basically, Ukraine was trying to join the West, the European Union, and Israel was trying to join the East, normalizing with Saudi Arabia. Russia stopped the first, and Iran stopped the second. The question is, can we now overcome those 2 breaches, and basically tilt the world toward this world of inclusion that you both described so well, against the world of resistance? That's the struggle. And it's a very, very big struggle. But it starts with our president understanding that Russia and Iran are in the same camp in this war, okay? And one isn't just, sort of a little misguided, okay? Iran was providing the drones that Russia used to kill Ukrainian civilians and democracy. So if we want to win this war globally between the forces of inclusion and the forces of resistance, we better know who's on whose side, starting with our own president.
All right. We got to close on that note. The task at hand is to find a ladder that even if Tom Friedman were to get on that ladder, the glass would still be half full. Thank you all.
Thanks, dear. That was good. That was really good for you. Really good. Really good.